Before we begin that story, though, I want to just let you know it will contain disturbing accounts of sexual violence and killings. Because warnings are growing from the United Nations and human rights experts that a major massacre may be imminent in Sudan. And worryingly, the situation has all the hallmarks of what happened in another city, El Fasher, in the run-up to a wave of ethnic-based slaughter there last year. Now, as many of you will know, a civil war has been ongoing in Sudan for more than 3 years, pitting the country's military-led government against a paramilitary group called the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. The war has caused what, by almost every measure, is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. More than 14 million people have been forced to flee their homes, and while figures are hard to verify, the most authoritative estimates of the number of people killed in the war range from 150,000 to as high as 400,000. Now, the fears of an impending massacre centre on El Obeid, one of the biggest cities in the country, which is located in the strategically important Kordofan region. It's right now under the control of the Sudanese armed forces. So that's the sort of official government armed forces. But the RSF, which is the paramilitary, has surrounded it and is basically laying siege to the city. So El Obeid is already being bombarded by drones, and because of the siege, the prices of food and other goods have gone way up. And there are shortages of electricity and clean drinking water. Of course, that's awful enough, but the real fear is about what might happen if the RSF get inside. Here is UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, speaking in Geneva.
The signs from El Obeid are clear and unmistakable. Another human rights catastrophe is unfolding in Sudan, this time in the capital of the strategic state of North Kordofan. The international community cannot allow a repeat of the widespread atrocities that took place in Zamzam camp for displaced people and in Al Fasher in North Darfur last year. This is not a drill. It is a red alert that needs to land on the desks of heads of state and government around the world. Their phones should be running hot in the coming days and weeks with ideas on how to prevent atrocity crimes in El Obeid and in other places in Kordofan.
Turk was referring there to the massacre carried out by the RSF in the city of El Fasher after the RSF captured it in October last year. That was an eventuality that Turk and the UN and many others had also warned about before it happened. It wasn't a surprise. It's hard to stomach the horror of what unfolded. The UN Human Rights Office documented more than 6,000 killings in just the first 3 days. Some experts think the death toll is as high as 70,000, particularly given that at least 150,000 residents of El Fasher remain unaccounted for. Indeed, there was so much killing that forensic experts from Yale University were able to see large pools of blood from space. The squares marked by Yale in this satellite image are what researchers describe as clusters of objects and red discoloration, which translates as bodies and blood. In February, the UN concluded that genocide had been committed. The reason we're going into detail about what happened in El Fasher is that the UN and others are clear in their belief that the same thing could happen now in El Obeid. And clear in their belief that it didn't have to happen, and this doesn't have to happen. So our government is also right at the centre of all of this. Last month, Nathaniel Raymond, a respected human rights investigator at Yale University, who has been closely tracking the war, had this extraordinary exchange with Labour MP Sarah Champion at the Commons International Development Committee about the fact that the United Arab Emirates, a close UK ally, is the main supporter of the Rapid Support Forces.
Your work has been focusing on Sudan and the interventions that I've seen and the evidence that you've documented and shown to parliamentarians here has a lot of it's been around Al Fasher. I wonder if the changes within FCDO have helped or hindered the UK government to be able to amplify the very powerful evidence that you were presenting to them. And do you basically feel that the FCDO did as much as they could to try and stop the genocide that was going on in real time, that you were literally showing them satellite images of?
To answer the second part of your question first, ma'am, no, they did not do everything they could. The atrocity prevention team, in specific moments, specific individuals, acted, I think, honorably and in some cases heroically, to attempt to do what they could within political constraints, however, that prevented the assets of the atrocity prevention team from mattering. At the end of the day, the atrocity prevention team was in a command environment on a ministerial level in which there was political capture by the risk to affecting the relationship with the United Arab Emirates that would be required to be confronted if the threat to al-Fashir was to be addressed. In short, the atrocity prevention team was a bright light in the dark sky of basically an absence of political will to deal with the strategic alliance of the RSF's main military enabler, which made the massacre in al-Fashir possible.
So to summarise, you are suggesting, or your evidence is indicating, that FCDO decided to take the relationship with the UAE over calling out the mass atrocities that you could document were going on.
100%.
Okay. Why?
Because it was easier.
Well, that's a hell of an accusation. It is true that the Foreign Office never mentioned the UAE, so the United Arab Emirates, widely documented as being the most important backer of the RSF in the run-up to genocide in al-Fashir. So what about Al Abed? Well, in June, Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper said this on X. We have pushed the UN Security Council to agree unanimously that the RSF assault on Al Abed must stop, that civilians must be protected, and that there will be no impunity for the perpetrators of war crimes. I've met survivors of previous atrocities now camped at the Sudan border. We cannot let this happen again. So again, no mention of the UAE, only pressure on the RSF itself, which presumably the UK government has a lot less leverage over than it does over the UAE. By July the 3rd, there was the tiniest of shifts. So take a look at this clip she posted on X.
The RSF and the SAF must agree to a ceasefire for the people of Sudan. We saw the most horrendous atrocities in al-Fashir. We cannot see that happen again. Those who are fueling this conflict must stop. We have seen more than a dozen countries involved in different aspects of arms flows and supports for the different warring parties. So those with influence must use it now because the violence must end.
So SAF is the Sudanese Armed Forces, so the official Sudanese military. And you had an allusion there to a dozen countries who were sort of intervening or supporting this war going on. Again, though, no direct mention of the United Arab Emirates. Barry, so this seems like there's confidence that there is some sort of imminent massacre about to happen. What's the sort of timescale we're talking? Is this sort of the next few days, the next few weeks? Is it just something that might happen at some point?
Yeah, that is really hard to say. We don't know. We don't know for sure when that's going to happen or if it's going to happen. The RSF has been laying siege to El Obeid for about 18 months, which is around about the time that they captured al-Fashir. They laid siege to it for about 18 months before they overran it and captured it. So we can't say for certain, but I would contend that if you have so many organizations, including the UN Human Rights Council, issuing more and more dramatic warnings, it would suggest that at least they believe that it might be imminent. And then I think there's also a question as to whether or not, when and if it does overrun El Obeid, will it do the same thing as it did in al-Fashir? i.e., will it slaughter tens of thousands of people? There is sort of, I guess, one slight difference, which is that acts of genocide were committed. Genocide was committed in al-Fashir because the RSF is primarily an Arab paramilitary organization, and it tends to engage in ethnically motivated slaughter against Black African communities. It actually grew out of the Janjaweed, who many people will probably remember committed a genocide in Darfur about 20 years ago. So the RSF effectively grew out of the genocide. And actually, in fact, some RSF fighters, when they were killing people in al-Fashir, said that they were finishing the job from 20 years ago. So there isn't as big a population of Black African communities in El Obeid, but that doesn't mean that they won't engage in wholesale slaughter, because, you know, they also engage in reprisals. They also attack people who they believe may have been sympathetic to the Sudanese armed forces or aligned with the Sudanese forces in some way. And, you know, we've seen this pattern when they capture towns, they go on these awful rampages of killing. I mean, look, what happened in El Fasher was a nightmare. You know, we're talking about 60 to 70,000 people, as you said, killed. There were mass killings. There was one documented incident where there were about 1,000 people, civilians, who were gathered together, I think, in a sort of a university compound. The RSF opened fire on that crowd of 1,000 people with heavy weaponry and killed about 500 of them. I remember there was a woman interviewed in Al Jazeera who said that she witnessed it and it was like a horror movie. There were also RSF fighters filming themselves on mobile phones, seemingly having a wonderful time slaughtering people. Those videos went around and they were absolutely horrific. And women were raped in huge numbers. They raped girls of 7 years old. They raped women into their 70s. They raped pregnant women. They raped people in front of their families, children in front of their mothers. And when their fathers tried to intervene, they were killed. I mean, I'm outlining all this really difficult stuff because I really want people to understand what the world stood by and allowed to happen 8 months ago when it knew it was going to happen. And I'm outlining the horror because I want to make it clear that 8 months later, we're back there and we're not seeing much of a difference in terms of how people are responding or not responding. Just to move on to the UAE thing, which is key in that, obviously, in that extraordinary clip of Nathaniel Raymond at the parliamentary committee there. The UAE is all over this. I mean, all over this. They deny it, of course, but the reporting, the documenting is absolutely clear. That's come from media organizations, but it's also come from groups that track conflict, like Nathaniel Raymond's group in Yale. And this isn't just based on sources, you know, although there are sources who are speaking out. It's based on a satellite imagery. It's based on flight logs. It's based on vessel tracking. It's even been documented by mobile phone locations, where people have found tracked phones as they moved from, say, Ethiopia into Sudan, because you know that some arms are coming in through Ethiopia, or as they moved in other routes into Sudan with arms. They're providing them with drones. They're providing them with weapons. They're providing them with money. They've provided them with mercenaries from Colombia. That's well documented. And there are some analysts who, like, how key the UAE support is that there are some analysts who say that if the UAE was to decide that this is, you know, more trouble than it's worth, and was to withdraw support from the RSF tomorrow, that the RSF could be defeated in 2 weeks. Now, I'm not trying to take sides in Sudan's war here, but both sides have committed war crimes. But the RSF have committed many, many more than the Sudanese armed forces. Again, I'm not trying to justify anything that Sudanese armed forces have done, but what I'm saying is that the RSF needs to be stopped. And so to move on to Britain's involvement, and I think why Britain is actually a really important player here. So the UK is what's called a pen holder for Sudan in the UN Security Council. So a pen holder, it's kind of like an informal designation that a Security Council member will be given to take on a sort of a case of concern, right? So Britain is the pen holder for Sudan. What that in effect means is that Britain takes responsibility for drafting resolutions, for leading debates and leading negotiations. So what Nathaniel Raymond, I think, also told the committee was that for him, that put Britain in a sort of a uniquely influential position in the run-up to what happened to El Fasher. And I think he also said that he briefed Foreign Office officials maybe a dozen times. And then the other thing that I want to sort of drop in here is that British weapons were found in the possession of the RSF in Sudan. So there were small arms target systems, engines for armored personnel carriers that were found with the Rapid Support Forces in combat zones. I think The Guardian reported that based on UN dossiers it had seen. Now, we know clearly what happened there. Britain sold the weapons to the UAE, and then the UAE gave that weapons and equipment to the RSF. Here's the really shameful part that I think a lot of people need to know about. This was also reported in The Guardian. In March of last year, the UN Security Council had information that the UAE was supplying British-made arms to the RSF. That information was passed to the British government, and a month later, the British government signed another arms deal with the UAE. So we have a situation here when we're talking about the government here, where the government here was in a pretty powerful position as pen holder on the Security Council, where the government here knows for sure that some of the arms it has sold to the UAE has ended up with a paramilitary group that has then committed acts of genocide. And now we're in a situation where the warnings are imminent, and let's look at what the British government is doing. Let's look at what Yvette Cooper is doing. As you showed there are statements about several countries or a dozen countries being involved. Yeah, there are other countries involved. Russia's involved, Turkey's involved, Egypt's involved, Iran is involved. But none of them are involved on the scale of the United Arab Emirates. It's the United Arab Emirates who are fueling this. It's the United Arab Emirates who are crucial to this. And yet, do we ever hear the United Arab Emirates mentioned? No, we don't. We didn't hear it mentioned in the run-up to al-Fashir, and now we're not hearing it mentioned in the run-up to El Obeid. And I think why that's important is because there are some experts who believe that the UAE responds to public shaming. I think this is really interesting. There are some experts
it's
who
like
believe...
Dubai, right? They've got this.
Yeah,
they've got an
exactly.
international
Exactly.
sort of image. They're very focused on brand. I just want to sort of go a couple steps back in terms of the civil war. I'm by no means an expert, but you had the overthrow of Bashar
al-Assad.
No, not
Sorry.
Bashar al-Assad. That's
Omar al-Bashir.
Omar al-Bashir. In 2019, he had the RSF kind of as his paramilitary organization and the Sudanese Armed Forces as the official military. Sort of immediately after his overthrow, the SAF and the RSF sort of ran the country in a joint fashion. And over the last 2 years or so, or 2 years ago,
3 years ago.
3 years ago, that relationship broke down and a civil war began to sort of rule the country, essentially. The SAF, supported by neighbors, Egypt, also Saudi Arabia, the RSF, supported principally, as you've been saying, by the UAE. This is partly due to sort of a conflict over access to gold, but I think more significantly, it's about sort of key ports on the Red Sea.
Spot on, yeah.
And I suppose ultimately you want one side to win in a civil war, generally, unless you're going to have some kind of peace deal. And it seems like the RSF, I mean, they're the paramilitary group. The SAF, I'm sure they're not a bunch of nice guys, but they are the official military organization. So the argument I understand that you seem to be making is if the UAE were to cut off their support for the RSF, then the SAF, the official military, would be able to reassert control over the country, and the civil war would essentially come to an end.
Yeah, well, that's what a lot of experts are saying, and it's hard not to say that would be a good thing. Again, you're right. The SAF, the military junta, which they are in effect, are not angels, but they have not been engaging in the same level of war crimes and genocide that the RSF has. And you're right. The war needs to come to an end so that Sudan and the Sudanese people politically have some kind of chance to move forward. And there was a lot of excitement when Omar al-Bashir was overthrown. And, a lot of sort of civil society groups and young people were involved in that. And they had ideas for how they wanted Sudan to develop in terms of its political system. And then all those hopes were torn up when, these two men, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo and Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the leaders of the Sudanese Armed Forces and the RSF fell out and pulled the whole country into war. The other thing is that it could split the country. like this could lead to Sudan being split. I interviewed the Al Jazeera correspondent in Sudan, Hiba Morgan, on my podcast, Proximities, a few weeks ago. And I asked her, is there a chance that Sudan could split? And she said, in effect, it already kind of is splitting, because the areas that the RSF controls, the RSF is sort of running governments there. There was even a report in Reuters that they've started to issue some form of currency. So, if this continues, we could see Sudan split, and initially that would be a massive disaster for the people of Sudan.
And then there'd be a kind of UAE proxy, and then a kind of Egypt-Saudi proxy.
Yeah, I guess, and you're right about the UAE. I mean, what the UAE, which by the way, the UAE, I do want to say this: the UAE is becoming one of the most nefarious actors on the diplomatic stage. It's interfering in countries all across the Horn of Africa. Whether that's Somaliland, Somalia, Ethiopia, where it's also a key backer of the Ethiopian government, and in Sudan, it's just, the UAE is out of control right now in the Horn of Africa. And yes, they're trying to back a horse who they want to see in power in Sudan. The RSF happens to control the regions where most of the gold mines are. The UAE is, I believe, the world's biggest buyer of gold, the world's biggest consumer of gold, but it doesn't produce any gold. So it wants Sudan's
processes it
gold.
And sells it.
Exactly. So it wants Sudan's gold. Also, it has massive agricultural interests in Sudan. The UAE imports most of its food.
Yeah.
So it has, and then you're right, the ports, the Red Sea ports, hugely strategic, and that's going to become a huge thing in the coming years. It's already big, but I think the race for Red Sea ports is a huge motivator for people. So what I'm saying is, the UAE will have to come to some kind of a calculation that it's more trouble than it's worth, because right now, I guess they see it as a potentially lucrative result for them if the RSF wins, or at least controls a large amount of territory.
Yeah, it makes more sense when we've done this story before, we have sort of brought up a map, because it does, if you look at the UAE, Qatar, these countries, they're on the Persian Gulf, they've got shed loads of money, but not much space. And then you've got Saudi Arabia, which is very large. Saudi Arabia sort of has one whole side of the Red Sea. And then the other side of the Red Sea is Egypt, Sudan, Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia. So, one side of the Red Sea is already taken for, the Saudis. Then the Yemenis, actually, then you've got another proxy conflict, haven't you, between Saudi Arabia and the UAE? Am I getting the sides right there? Yeah. In Yemen, and then you've got these proxy wars all the way down the side, because these very small countries, obviously Saudi's not small, but the UAE, Qatar, these small countries with lots of money,
Djibouti, Somaliland,
want to protect their interests in a place that has lots of strategically located land, but not particularly sort of, I guess when I mentioned militaries.
I guess when I mentioned Djibouti and Somaliland, what I'm saying is those are countries that can be manipulated by these big powers, and can be bribed by these big powers. And what happened recently in Somaliland? Somaliland, just to remind our listeners and viewers, is a breakaway region of Somalia that Somalia does not recognize as an independent nation, but has effectively been running as one, and a pretty successful one for a long time. No country in the world had formally recognized Somalia as a state until, guess who did recently? Israel.
Oh, Israel. I thought you were going to say the UAE.
No, Israel.
When you also look at the map, you do feel like Ethiopia, no access to the sea, and Eritrea's got it all.
Oh, that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah, I don't want to say who should get that access to the sea. I think probably the borders should all stay where they are.
Well, Ethiopia used
thing to go for.
Before
Eritrea broke away.
Yeah,